Well, thanks so much for joining us. Today we have the great pleasure of talking to Dr. Sarah Trocchio. She's the proud founder and the owner of the Square Peg Club and a career coaching and strategy firm, which is a career coaching and strategy firm, for like badass academics of all kinds of stripes looking to really like stir shit up in their careers. She has nearly 2 decades of experience doing intersectionality and equity work. She's a social worker and an educator. And I feel like she just kind of channels all of that into this honed advocacy tool to serve academics at critical professional junctures to bravely start what she calls their next first thing. She obtained her MSW from Boston University in 2011 and her PhD in criminal justice from Rutgers, and became nationally board certified as a coach through the Center for Credentialing Education in 2022. In addition to helping academics kind of get real about their core values and how they can best be activated to prompt greater professional freedom and fulfillment, she's also an assistant professor of sociology and criminology at Rider University. So thanks, Sarah, for joining us.
Thank you, Shannon. I just want to give a huge shout out to the whole ASC team, particularly the DCS subdivision that has been working so amazingly on this AltAc stuff. And just wanted to give you a shout out and the rest of the team that's here or not here. I've just been so heartened and delighted to get to know you all and the work that you're doing.
Thanks so much. Well, I think we'll start off, kind of naming the elephant in the room. So normally we talk to lots of folks with PhDs doing research in AltAc spaces. And in fact, you're not doing research in AltAc space. You're actually an assistant professor, which makes you incredibly unique for our series. But you do something incredibly cool, which is doing a lot of career coaching for academics. And that could be academics looking to stay in academia or academics trying to just find their next first thing. So can you talk to us a little bit about kind of how you got involved in career coaching and kind of this strategy space?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's so interesting, sort of like how we come to think of ourselves as our full-time occupations first. I mean, that's such like a normative way about thinking of things. And I would say, like, I kind of am researching in the AltAc space. It's just in kind of a funky way that's really fun and applied. So I'll kind of get to that as I start this conversation. But I know we don't have a ton of people here, so if folks want to kind of jump in and join the conversation at any point, please feel free to interrupt me, to just jump on in. I want this to be as warm and helpful as possible. So just wanted to get that out there. So a couple of things about me. I have, the great fortune of having done a lot of shit before going into the academy. So I have some other sort of like professional experience and educational experience that has kind of anchored my scholar activism and kind of made me a bit of a proud academic misfit, like since the beginning of time. So before I went into academia, I worked as a social worker. I was sort of on the front lines of some pretty gnarly child protective service work at the height of mass incarceration and also in the midst of a lot of sort of anti-immigration sentiment. So I have that experience that kind of crystallized my interest in conversations, right? And like from there, I always thought, I'm gonna go be a therapist and everything will be cool. I'll be some like radical therapist. It's like, doing all this great stuff and incorporating systematic issues and systemic issues, and it'll be wonderful. So I went to get my master's in social work and in 2009 and was like, wait a second, this feels too constricting to me. Like it feels kind of suffocating. I don't enjoy the medical model and sort of the pathology centric way that social work, particularly at that time, I mean, we're talking 15 years ago at this point, we're training clinical social workers. So I was like, no, I don't think this is going to work for me. But I ended up finding this amazing social work research center that was called the Center for Addictions Research and Services. I somehow, as we do in academia, waited in the hallway on the carpet, eating some overpriced bagel, which was the only thing I could afford as a grad student, waiting for the professor that ran the center to walk by so I could talk to her. And honestly, me working there was so driven by financial need. And we don't talk enough about that. Like when we tell the later stories, we're like, oh, I was in graduate research fellow at the Center for Addictions Research and Services. Yes, I was. And yes, a huge motivator for that was that I was making a $14,000 stipend living in Boston, Massachusetts, and I could not survive. Like that's the period, right? Like that's the end of the story pretty much. Except it's not totally. I started working at the center and got really, really interested in folks that have been duly diagnosed with all sorts of substance misuse issues, as well as any kind of social behavioral issue that had presented itself while they had been doing a spell of incarceration. And so the whole sort of like top burst open in terms of mass incarceration, because this was 2009, 2010. I mean, we were just starting to see the tiny downturn, but so much conversation was still about, well, yeah, it's totally legit to take somebody that's in possession of X amount of cannabis and put them in prison for 3 or 4 years. So a lot of the people that I encountered in that research center doing focus groups were non-white men that had been just swept up in the justice system really unfairly. And so from there, I was like, all right, I'm going to go do some, again, pretty badass, cool, radical research, and I'll go on my merry way and I'll publish in peer-reviewed research. Maybe I'll be an expert testifier and I'll be an amazing educator and I'll die happy. Didn't have it quite like that. But I ended up going to Rutgers and getting my PhD there. It was not an easy experience for many reasons, and I'm sure a number of us are familiar with, and sort of how graduate training can be and look like. I don't think it was different from a lot of places, but it didn't mean it felt good. You know what I mean? And again, because of financial necessity, I was hustling the entire time I was in my PhD program. I was adjuncting online, I was doing, textbook question bank writing, and I also ended up working at this health tech company. And I was basically doing caregiving coaching for people that needed assistance with chronically ill or elderly family members, like navigating the system. And because I had this social work experience, I was able to do it. And I loved the sort of communication conversation piece. I just loved it so much. And so when I was finishing my doctorate, I had since moved to Florida, was very geographically isolated, was teaching online, was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And I ended up trying to figure out, should I take this job in this health tech company full time, or should I just give it a go and try this tenure track thing if I get so lucky, right, as to get a position? I did not apply for one research level job in terms of the designation, the Carnegie designation of the university. At that point, I was incredibly traumatized by academic research and wanted to kind of like move a little bit further away from it. I did a critical race theory informed dissertation and didn't really feel that there was as much excitement for the perspective that I was bringing to criminology and criminal justice as I had hoped there'd be. But I wasn't that surprised, you know what I mean? And so I got incredibly lucky and I got a job talk in the area of the country that I wanted to live in, that was closer to family, that my partner could somehow finagle with his job in Florida to work remotely so that we could move up here. And I just figured at the time, like, I got to give this a go. Like, I've spent all this time prepping for this. I got to give this a shot. So I was 7 months into my tenure track position when COVID hit, and I also had a 2-year-old child. And that 4-month period was one of the most horrifically challenging I've ever experienced in my life. And one in which I started seeing pretty clearly, these academic institutions, for as many statements that they have, even the really cool, student-centered ones that are smaller and have more resources for faculty that aren't just about research support, are failing caregivers right now. And it wasn't at all different from the way that I had been felt as a woman, as a mom, as somebody that didn't identify as sort of like this quant rock star. You know what I mean? It was just like yet another way that I felt excluded and sort of pushed to the side. And so I got kind of loud about it, as I do as a Northeastern gal. I started writing in my school newspaper about, institutional racism, sexism, and the impacts on scholarship, particularly for caregivers. And I started sending every New York Times and Guardian article I could find about research disparities that were really starting to get horrific in the midst of this caregiving crisis and the lockdown. And even though I'm at a school where there's very, by all standards, lax research requirements, you still have to be active. And it still just felt like we were just returning back to this conversation in which we were going to unduly lift up and privilege academic research at all costs, right? And with that, the prestige that goes with it. So a lot of people are actually surprised to find out, including some of my clients, I don't have tenure. Technically an early career researcher. I'm technically a junior faculty member. And it can take people aback that I'm sort of out here talking about my discontentment with the academy, talking about the times that I've been disappointed in my own job, and also talking about the business that I now have. And I don't give a fuck because it feels good and I feel like I'm being super authentic. So yes, I am a professor right now, but as long as I have this protected and privileged space, I'm going to use my voice to advocate for my students, to advocate for contingent employees at those institutions like mine and mine, advocate for marginalized populations, and use my experience as a professor to inform and improve how I coach.
I mean, I think that's awesome. I think we all feel kind of your passion about really pushing back, and we'll talk a little bit about leaning into what it means to be critical of institutions that you're working in. But I think what I'm hearing from this is that there has been a legacy of sorts of moving through spaces and maybe feeling unhappy or disenfranchised, bluntly, or even also feeling grief about that it's not what you expected it to be. And I think that is something we always talk about. It's kind of the grief around kind of the journey, and we'll kind of get to that here shortly. But I want to also say that I think that there is kind of this expectation a little bit that people move through these spaces, and whether they dislike it or not, that they kind of keep their mouth shut about if they dislike it or not. I think in part that's just kind of an American culture of just like playing nice, and not rocking the boat, right? Going along to get along, right? I think it's just kind of our culture more generally. And then kind of what that means then as women, right? You're especially assumed to go along to get along, right? And any conversation that exists beyond that is you really rocking their boat in a way that's disruptive, quote unquote. So I appreciate you being quote unquote disruptive and loud.
Thank you.
as your New England self. But a lot of what you do is really about coaching people towards like their next first thing. Now that you've kind of like seen that it can be done, people don't have to be an academic. They can be a founder of a coaching company and be teaching, and those things can be equally important, and no one identity comes before the other. So can you tell us a little bit more about what the next first thing is and kind of how you help folks get started doing it?
Yeah, and I mean, I love that we're going with the grief right now. Sorry, that's my dog and my cat doing something on this rainy afternoon. But yeah, this idea that like we're supposed to keep our head down and just keep plugging, is so entrenched in the academy and makes it really hard to even make space for that grief, which is like kind of a natural part of this process. As somebody that has gone through, for instance, the loss of a parent, like I understand it takes a while. And they say about grief, you can't like go around it. You just kind of like gotta go through that shit. And it's not always fun, but it's a necessary process to get some clarity on the other side. So one of the things that people, I think, when I first see them have to grieve and then sort of work past and then become super empowered and excited about is this idea that they actually don't have to go and seek that same glaring vocational awe that led them into the academy in the first place. Like I remember after COVID, when people were working online and there was all this sort of like existential stuff around quiet quitting and the Great Resignation. I mean, we just saw all of these alternative academic spaces flooded, and I mean flooded, with UX, user experience, also known as user experience design, research jobs. And I'm not knocking those jobs whatsoever. They're great jobs for a certain subset of the PhD or graduate level population that has the skills and interests to do something like that. But I think part of the problem is that because of our acculturation in the academy, we put so much pressure on ourselves even in the midst of this grief and even in the midst of this transitional period where we're like trying on these different possibilities to have identified the next thing that is going to give us lifetime vocational awe. And so the sort of like grounding theory that works for all of my clients that I engage with is just for us to like figure out how to get them to just turn the temperature down a little bit on that expectation, and to have them be really mindful that they're not just seeking to sort of like rapidly replicate that sensation and fill it with something else, because ultimately that might be a little bit of a band-aid rather than sort of like more of a substantive solution at having a satisfying career and life. So when I talk about my next first thing, it's truly that. It's working with clients one-on-one, having really bold conversations in which we are playful and are curious, and we focus on this piece of our identity. And I work almost exclusively with women and folks that identify as non-binary, that we as folks gendered in that way are not often given space to do, which is to desire. Period, right? To have desire. And so much of the way that we've talked about desire, particularly female desire, is so steeped in the way that we've been sexualized, but like actually desire is so multifaceted and it's so complex and it's so nuanced. And we often don't get the time and space to really sit and like in some like sacred glory be like, what the fuck do I want? Like, and that's a really powerful exercise when people are allowed to do it. And so the next first thing really just means we're going to be playful and explore your desires, and then identify something you want to go after. And it doesn't have to be the thing that you think is going to be like you're going to X out professor on your tombstone and put the next thing. Like it doesn't have to be that heavy. For some people, it's just like, I want to get the F out. I want to have more time with my kids, or I want to have more time to cross country ski, or I want to have more time to garden, or to be a friend, or to deal with my chronic disability, or whatever it is. And for some of those people, it's about how do we identify and successfully secure some kind of employment outside of the academy, whether that's AltAc, where we have some kind of mapping of our academic identities onto the work that we're doing, or non-academic, like, no, I'm kind of jettisoning all of this stuff and kind of really switching gears here. But I've also worked with like amazing people, for instance, that have been at institutions for a while in various positions, and they're like, maybe there's another role that I could like actually advocate for within this institutional setting, and like totally change up what I'm doing and like negotiate to get a damn raise. And so I've successfully worked with people that haven't left their academic institutions, but they completely sort of like rediscerned how they want to participate. And they basically said, I'm going to lay it out on the table and tell people like, I need, for instance, over 2 years, course releases every semester, so I can explore this like high impact consulting thing that's about a real world issue that I really want to do, right? Like that's the kind of stuff that I work with clients on as well. And then of course, there's some people that are absolutely gobsmacked like I was by starting to have these conversations and then realizing they're creatives or they're entrepreneurs, right? And they need to figure out like, how do I even understand what a business plan is? How do I even understand what it is to be a solopreneur? And so I work with folks in that regard. And there's other people who are like, you know what? I want to take a really good, solid, like 6-week course that my institution is going to pay for in web design. Because you know what? I've always done it on the side and I just want to see how it feels, right? So the next first thing can be any of those things, all of those things, and none of those things. There's nothing prescriptive about my relationship with clients, but it is always fundamentally about uncovering, naming, and then claiming those desires.
Well, and what I love about that so much is that this idea that you're latching on to trying to go for that, what you call the vocational awe, right? Like you're almost chasing a high of this idea of like, oh, it has to be this really grand thing because we're all a bunch of type A's, you know, people who are highly motivated by achievement. And of course, we want everything we to do to be at that level. I remember this weekend, I've been on site visits all weekend. I'm exhausted doing 8 hours of site visits, going home, typing notes. And on Friday, even though I'm someplace that I don't live and has great food and I want to go out and play, I slept. And then I had to have a really long conversation with myself that like, it's okay that my day is not productive. Like not every day needs to be productive. And there's something to being well when I don't have productive days. And so I think the idea that as you're uncovering your desires, that those desires don't have to be huge. You know, they can be, I want to travel more. One of mine for a long time was, I just want to do more enjoyable reading, right? Like I want to sit outside more in the sun, right? And those things can be the things that you're working towards. And I think that's really empowering once we start learning that all the things that we're doing in life don't have to be to an end. And that end in particular doesn't have to be grand.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if it is, cool. And I'm there for it. I love it. Right. But to give yourself the space to really try to be critical about whether or not that is something that you intrinsically internally desire, or we've sort of gotten used to that dopamine rush of being acknowledged, of achieving, of all the things that you were sharing or intimating, right? That people that go and get doctoral degrees tend to be like.
Correct. Yeah. Well, and so to be able to kind of take a step back and to really think critically about pushing back against this notion that everything that we do has to be high achieving, you know, we have to really allow ourselves to be in those spaces. And so, you know, we talked previously that amongst kind of the people that you mentor, that you see this like same pattern of things over and over, which is really people not able to get in touch with their desires because they're really stuck in kind of this permission structure of the university. And that there's like this, you know, they defer to difference. And I've heard you use that at ASC before and a couple other times. So can you talk us through like what that means for you and kind of what does that look like and sound like to defer to difference?
So when I talk about deferring to deference, it kind of fits within this whole permission structure that you so beautifully laid out. And it's something that a lot of people have to kind of work really intentionally to get past. And I mean, I think one of the things is that we get trained in an apprenticeship model. Like we all know that, we throw that phrase around. I don't know that we really like stop and think about like what that means. Like we're basically like, you know, working with a sheep milk curdler for like, you know, 9 years, figuring out like the beauty of the craft. And our job is not to be the expert, you know, like curd maker, or to be like, well, maybe I'm fucking vegan and I don't want to make curds, right? Like we don't train ourselves to think about our training in that way, right? We have this idea and this notion from when we start graduate school that we have these professional elders, and we acknowledge them as elders, yes, in part because of their experience. But what's a little different from the sheep milk, you know, cheese curds piece of this is that there's also this status component that is so pronounced in the academy. And so, of course, there's a lot of autonomy in getting a doctorate or being an academic. That's such a big reason that people identify wanting to go into the academy. But particularly as the acculturation process sort of unfurls itself from initial graduate training and coursework to independent research under mentorship to being an early career researcher and all that stuff, some of that autonomy I really believe is feigned, right? Because we might have it in name, you know, how we talk about, you know, the distinction between laws in the books and laws in the street, right? Like we have some of that operating in the way that we're trained, right? There's this sort of like law on the books that being an academic is just ripe with autonomous inquiry, right? And being self-possessed. And yet so many of the structures in the academy actually seek to tamp that down, particularly when you're like a baby academic, right? Who doesn't yet have the status. So, I mean, I can think of I was just like listing a couple of things that I was thinking about in my years of training and even to date, like of all the things that we're given advice around, that's really, you know, you're voluntold to do things, and you're voluntold to do things by people that have the status that you are presumed to be seeking. So why would you challenge it, right? They're the professional elders. They know best, right? So what skills should we be emphasizing? What kind of research should we be doing from a methodological and a subtopic area perspective? What conferences should we be applying for? How should we be drafting and framing our abstracts? How should we be talking about teaching in our teaching statements, right? Like it goes on and on. What journals we should be targeting when we're writing things, what grants we're applying for. And so what I have found is that sort of the cumulative effect of that is this erosion in one's ability to even make sense of their own internal desires. Because while they might have started graduate school with the expectation of the hope that that was what was going to launch them forward, and they thought that they were going to be able to do so with like a great deal of autonomy, that deference to deference structure just entrenches itself and makes it really hard 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later to even figure out what you even desire, what you even care about, both from a perspective of like skills and content and knowledge areas, but also verbiage, like what you actually spend your time doing. So you can imagine that like a lot of people will reach out and be like, I just need help converting my CV to a resume. Probably not, right? You probably need some really solid assistance and witnessing of your grief, right? And of like kind of unraveling and being self-critical, not in a castigatory way, but being critical about the structures that you're embedded in, and think how they might have made it harder for you to identify what you care about. So in a way, I think some of the mad rush to like UX design is a way that we see this deference to deference operating. And by the way, that's why I made the cheeky comment at the beginning of our conversation. I actually do AltAc research because I'm doing like a massive qualitative study at this point. I'm not planning on publishing it, but I'm using it to improve my practice. And I am applying the really rigorous research skills that I've fought my ass off to get at Rutgers and beyond into this population that I'm serving to figure out what are these mechanisms, what are these processes that I'm seeing, and how can I more effectively help guide people through them.
Well, and I think that's really interesting. I mean, I think the idea that, it starts so early about having academic elders, really not challenging it. I mean, I cannot tell you the amount of times I've been voluntold to do several things. And so, and we think about them as like, this will be good for me. This will get me where I want to go. I should be grateful. I must be the competent one if they're naming me as the voluntold one, right? Like all of these backward compliments and twisted narratives you create, right? And I think you're right that in that I'm just, this is what I'm supposed to do. And so I'm going to do it. And then at the end of, well, I took a long time to finish. So at the end of 8 years, really like, okay, well, actually, I don't really think I like a lot of that stuff. And then going into
right.
space, immediately doing stuff that I'm like, I really still don't think I like this. I've tried it on some more. And I think you're right. And I wonder though, for folks, I mean, you and I have had extensive conversations, myself and some other colleagues have had extensive conversations about like, how the hell did this happen? Like, what is in place that like creates this? And for folks that are like newer to the academy, or maybe are not in spaces where people are courageous and talking about it, can you help us name some of the reasons or some of the things that are at work in the larger system that is creating a space where we're pushing people in one singular line and not necessarily giving them space to critically think about their desires?
Yeah, I mean, I actually consider myself relatively naive about like the long view of higher education in this country and sort of how we calcified a lot of the structures that we now see. I have some like amazing friends and colleagues that have PhDs in ed policy, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much more I would love to. One day when I have more time to sit in the sun and read a book, I will read that just for fucking pleasure because I can't, right? Like without the expectation of anything else. But I think, one of them is the incentive structures, right? I mean, to get a PhD, you have to go to a research institution of some caliber, right? And to go to a research institution, you're with people that are self-selected. And I'll use that in air quotes because some people do kind of get, lovingly pushed along or pushed upstream in that way. But those people have then, to some extent, had to buy into this model as well, which is that you're not incentivized to teach, you're incentivized to do your research. You cannot humanly get the research done that you need to get done unless you utilize graduate student labor. That's just the way it works. And we created all these ways of talking about the academy that reflect some of the institutional priorities that are in alignment with research classifications and the Carnegie system and all of that stuff, right? And so there then becomes this pressure to place students high, to have students then go to their satellite places when they then go to other research institutions and get grants, and keep you as the legacy holder, as the professional elder, benefiting from that progeny, I think is one of the big problems. And it's so out of line and out of step with what the actual range and sort of like median experience is of a PhD student looking even for a job in the professoriate. Most of them are not going to end up in those places. And yet we're not trained to even think about our own trajectories during our PhD education in that way. And I think it's really, really problematic. I also just tell it like it is. And I think we are obsessive about fame and ego in the academy. And I don't think that helps anything, right? We are like the ultimate bootstrapping Americana sort of like cultural value footprint, just like in giant highlighter, like in the red highlighter that I'm holding right now. The currency we have is name recognition and fame. That's just how it works, right? With some exceptions outside of some of the physical sciences and business and law, you are not going to get rich being a professor, no matter how prolific of a professor you are. And so the currency, yes, of course, is the peer review publications, of course, is, the grants that you get. But honestly, it's what you're able to name about yourself by virtue of securing those things. And so that makes a lot of mentors very concerned about sort of the reproduction of one's legacy, right? And so they're just going to try to figure out how to get you to help continue to rise their star or make sure their star doesn't fall. And that's unfortunately a really critical part, I think, of the culture. And then I also say that I think within that, there is so much like scarcity built into the elitism of the academy, right? And so it creates this sort of dog eat dog mentality of like, we're just, of course, not going to change our admission structure. We're going to let people in, even though we know that the percentage of jobs that are out there has declined substantively since the 70s or 80s or 90s. So we are just going to then, in turn, either implicitly or explicitly make it more competitive for those students to survive. And the way you do it is engage in the currency of the marketplace. And for the academy, the currency actually isn't currency, it's labor.
It is, yeah. And what's interesting as you describe that, I think when I was, a first year or a second year, I don't think I really understood that walking in the door. I saw a couple of things in my second and third year where I started to really like, okay, now I'm starting to put some pieces together. And the fourth and fifth, sixth year, it really coming like, oh, this is crystal clear. I understand how I am treated in this system. To the point where I even had faculty tell me like, you're no longer worth advocating for, and you're not the hill worth dying on anymore in staff meetings because you no longer benefit me because you don't want to get placed high, and
Yep.
I both appreciate the candor of like, you can't count on me to advocate for you, so you need to find a new path. And also like, it still doesn't hurt any less, right?
Right.
Especially when you feel like you're moving just as fast, you're doing all the things you're supposed to do. You're publishing, you're working, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're mentoring students, you're running large projects, right? Like you're doing all the things that the university has asked of you to make themselves look better. And yet still it's not enough because you haven't gone this way. And I don't necessarily want this space to be that folks cannot go into the academy because you're in the academy. There are other people on this call that are really interested or are currently working in the academy. And I don't think that's the takeaway message. I think the takeaway message is that these structures are in place and they exist, and that we have to be critical of them. And that whether you leave the academy like I did to some extent, although I'd argue, and I think you'll talk about this, that you can be in both spaces. It's not mutually exclusive. That that you have to be critical and courageous of these structures and be willing to hear what people have to say, that you're not worth advocating for. And or if you remain in the academy, that you understand how you may or may not participate in the structures, and that you do no harm to other people by being critical of the structures that you are employed by, and that you be thoughtful about that. About how to provide guidance to people who are like me of sorts, right? And so I wonder then, for folks that kind of do want to leave or are interested or toying with the idea or playing with it, given the structures that you've laid out, do you think it's possible then for people to find support, like real support, to be able to do more easily?
Absolutely. And I will say, I mean, I graduated not that long ago. It was 2019. But I have seen a real opening up of some of these conversations and a willingness to learn and grow, particularly among some faculty in research-centric departments. And I think that that's great. But I think we've just started the conversation. And so a lot of people's actual sensory experiences are outpacing the kinds of conversations we're having within the structure itself. So we need to have, obviously, better, braver mentorship. I would love not one student ever to have to hear what you heard, Shannon, because it's not okay, right? Even though it's normal, it's not okay, right? And it also doesn't match the employment picture either. And that's something that feels like especially sort of like nefarious about this whole thing. It's not like there's this doubling down of the structure itself, and there are these sort of like completely plentiful opportunities that we're just like teeming with, right? There's a market constriction, and there has been, and there's going to continue to be a market constriction in the academy because we overproduce PhDs. So I think that's part of what makes it feel especially like, yeah, that let's get to a place where that doesn't happen. And I think the most important thing is anybody just needs less insularity. People just need to feel less isolated. And while it is so wonderful that we get to have this very narrow, very deep, skill set and knowledge set around our particular, like dissertation topic, I think that can have a really isolating effect sort of in terms of our networks. And then on top of that, you add the fact that there's so much competition for scarce resources in the academy, particularly when we're doing research related stuff. And so we don't often think that we have the luxury, right, to even take the time, right, to get to know other people. So I think this connects to our earlier stuff, but the one piece of advice is like, just the courage to name what feels off, right? Like to name what feels off, to name what feels like you are about to grieve or are grieving or have grieved, right? And then to really do your damnedest to put yourself in situations that are going to nurture your internal and intrinsic motivation and desire. How do we do that? Well, we do that by, having conversations like this, by attending conversations like this, by being curious about podcasts like the Compassionate Professor, right, which are out there, and following people like Dr. Monica Cox, who is a freaking badass on Twitter and is one of the first and only tenured STEM engineers, Black female STEM engineers at her university, and talks openly about a lot of the discrimination and horrific abuse that she has faced, right? And talks openly about her business. And so just being able to find through social media, virtually or in person, people that are out there that are talking about this stuff, that are going to give you permission if you haven't even felt like you had it before, to start thinking on your own right? Like I have a friend who's an R1 professor and she loves it. Like she is so happy. She loves sitting at home and writing. She loves the peer review process. Good for her. Like I want her to flourish and be happy, right? But if there's a little gnawing part of you that feels like, damn, like there's a lot of dread here. There's a lot of disappointment. There's a lot of feeling like I'm not good enough. There's a lot of just feeling exhausted. Like those feelings deserve attention and space, even though we don't feel like we have them. And again, connecting to your point about like, we don't need to be ruthless about these binaries. We really don't. It's okay, right? We can take things one step at a time. We can say, I'm a professor and I have a business. We can just say that, right? I don't have to call it a side hustle. I'm not going to demean the work that I do in my coaching practice because I'm proud of it, right? And I acknowledge that there's professional risks in doing that, but that's authentic to me, right? I also know that I'm helping in my own mind break free from this idea, right? That my entire identity has to be all in or all out, right? In the academy and in the professoriate. In fact, no, I'm sort of moving between these different, very different universes. And the agility in doing so is actually making me sharper and happier. And so I think, again, just letting go of that vocational awe piece of like, you gotta be all in or you gotta be all out. I'm fully an academic or I've left and I'm not an academic anymore. Nobody will ever take the training and the skill set that you have away from you, ever, right? And so the idea is just like, what is a way that I can explore or try on or be playful with? One step I can take to just lean into this like curiosity or this kind of nagging feeling I have. And maybe there's something else I could explore. And maybe this path that I set out on myself doing when I was 25 or 26 or 30 has shifted and morphed now that I'm 35 or 40 or 45 as things go in our lives. That's part of the beauty of it.
What I really like about the conversation is like the idea that like, I'm just like kind of tired of being exhausted. Right. And I think, that it seems so silly, but I think that, I left after 8 years and I was like tired. I like felt like I needed to take a coma after. And, being like, I actually don't want to run that fast anymore. Like I can't do it. And I'm really interested in traveling or sitting outside and reading, or I'm really interested in spending more time with people that I don't see now that I live in the middle of the country, right? I moved from the DC area to Dallas. And now I'm like, wow, I can get to all my people within 2.5, 3 hours now. That's super cool. How can I do more of that? And I think that became a real priority, and being able to lean into these other ideas, I think, is important. And also giving ourselves the space to feel exhausted, to feel tired, to feel sad, I think is really empowering too. And being like, I don't really, if I'm going to continue to be disillusioned, at least I'm going to work someplace that I can wake up at 10 and go work wherever the hell I want. Right. But I think, one of the things that I'm also hearing from you is that, you can be all of the things, right? You can be an assistant professor. You can also be an entrepreneur. And you don't have to do research at all. And I think about how I'm now at a space, and I've kind of said this before, I'm kind of now at a space where I'm like, I don't know that I love doing original research anymore. But what I do love doing is science storytelling. I do love data visualization. I love the work that I'm doing this week, which is largely about working almost as a consultant or a technical assistance provider, helping an entire county restructure their court process to make sure we get folks, attorneys, earlier in the process to help them execute their constitutional rights of counsel. And it's actually in the context of there being a public defender crisis in this county, or rather in this state. And so it's so meaningful that I'm physically seeing more people getting counsel this week because of the work that I'm doing. We're seeing more thoughtful release arguments. We're seeing more thoughtful releases, all because of the work. And it doesn't necessarily have to be research. So I wonder, then, thinking about, students that are interested in, like, maybe saying, I have the brain power, I have the critical thinking skills, but I don't actually want to be even tangentially related to research. Like, what do we say to those folks in their kind of journey of finding what their desires are?
Yeah, like, let's figure out what is your why that led you to the academy in the first place. Then let's figure out, is that why still your why? Has your why shifted? So, like, in my case, my huge why was mass incarceration. Now, we are so far from resolving the issues of mass incarceration. We're so far from moving past the punitive regime and all of that stuff, right? And also, I entered into this discipline because of what was happening with current events around me that were different than they are today, 15 years later, right? So my why is naturally going to shift a little too, right? Because those cultural and societal circumstances have also shifted. I became a mother. Like, that was a hugely impactful experience that was not part of my life narrative or story when I was deciding to go to grad school and study criminal justice, right? I married a person that does a fabulous public defense work, right? Who is dealing with really intense death penalty cases all the time. And it's valuable and important to me to have the headspace and the emotional ability to be there with him through a lot of tough stuff that he has to deal with. And my expertise and my passion for all sorts of things connected to abolition, etc., are really helpful in having those conversations. And also, I don't necessarily feel the need anymore to be in this universe of narrowly researching and producing, in particular, a very certain kind of research around some of these metrics. And so part of my why was all those things. And part of my why, honestly, was people told me I should do it, right? People told me, I remember doing focus groups and meeting with folks that had been recently released and just always loving the conversational piece. And like what you just shared about what you're witnessing to me is like, when we talk about high impact work, right? Like, that is such a different kind of impact than you can make doing long-term, like, academic research. It just is. And it's also a different kind of impact than you can make even doing original research outside of an academic setting. And like, that's okay. And it's also really cool that you've provided the space that you need to like name that and then to go get it. Like, and look at where you are now, being able to do this really cool site visit, which I know has been exhausting and still awesome, right? And so I think that's part of it, to acknowledge that, what is your why? Has your why shifted? Why has your why shifted? If it has, also, don't be mean to yourself about it. It doesn't mean you're a crappy scholar. It doesn't mean you're a crappy academic. It means you're a human being and you have shifted and changed. in this great experiment that is being alive. And so be it, right?
I definitely think I really appreciate even the conversation about, like, you know, in the course of it, things, you know, you became a partner to someone, you became a mother, and that those things, while they might not have been, you know, on your radar when you started your vocational awe journey, that they have inherently changed you in what you want and what you're looking for. And I think that's also something that we don't really discuss a lot, is that, like, it's also okay to lean into those other identities that have not even nothing to do with research or academia at all, but have everything to do with, like, your life and being present for people, being emotionally available to them, like you're describing with your partner. And so I think all of those things are equally important, and those can also be part of your decision making. And I don't know that we give
Totally.
enough credit to folks for saying, I want to move to this place because it's closer to family, grandparents, and I want to start a family. I want to move here because I'm single. And if I live in the middle of America, I might not have a lot of dating options, you know, of people that I click with. So I want to be in a big city for that reason, right? Or I've talked with other folks. I wanted to live in this space because I'm gay and I feel safer living in the city rather than living
Totally.
in other places, right? So
Yes.
I think all of those things are equally as important in the decision making of whatever we're doing as our next first thing, for sure. And so I
Totally.
know that we have only 10 minutes left. And so
Yes.
I also want to give space for folks that are there. If you have questions, you know, feel free to come off mute or put them in the chat. I just want to provide space if there's anything so far.
Yes, please. If you have any questions, curiosities, anything, like, let me know. And you can also reach out to me one-on-one as well, if that feels better.
I saw Megan come off mute. I wasn't sure if you wanted to say something.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, just wow, like, thank you for sharing your experience. Everything really resonated with me and, like, validated everything I was feeling when I left academia. I left mid PhD program. And I've been having trouble finding a job. I have the same background as you, criminal justice and criminology, and I've been looking mostly for remote positions. So just any, like, guidance on, you know, where I should look to apply, or, you know, alternate fields that my skills could translate into would be really appreciated.
Sure. Yes, I'm happy to help. And you know, I thought about leaving so deeply when I was in my doc program, and in some ways, my life would have looked so much different. And I wish that there was more permission, not from the people that I loved, but from, like, my academic milieu to do that. So whether or not you received that support, please, you know, I'm extending, like, all the support to you for doing that. One follow-up question I have for you, Megan, is what are the roles that you're applying for?
So I've mostly been applying to research analyst or policy analyst roles. So things that were pretty closely aligned to what I did as a research assistant and as a graduate assistant. But like I said, I'm open to looking at outside work as well.
Do you fucking love research?
I do, and I miss it.
Okay. And you miss it. Okay. And what is, just giving a super quick breakdown of, like, what in particular research and policy topic wise you've been thinking about or trying to get?
Anything with violence prevention or criminal justice reform, policing reform, reducing mass incarceration, like just pretty much anything related to those topics.
And when you think about the materials that you had in particular, like your resume or resumes, how many resume or resumes do you have that are non-academic? And what was your experience like with the conversion process if you did have a CV before you made a resume?
Yeah, so I did have a CV before, and I applied to a bunch of jobs, and I got like no interview requests except for one, and that was like when I just converted my CV into a resume. But recently I worked with an HR consultant who helped me revamp my CV into my resume. Like, I talked to her for hours about what I did in grad school and stuff, and she helped me turn it into, like, a really business oriented resume. So I have two. There's one that's like criminology specific, where I list like my publications and stuff like that, and go more into depth with like the topics I have experience in. And then there's one that I have just for general jobs, where I don't go as much into detail with the criminal justice topics.
Okay, so one piece of advice that I can provide for you is I always recommend that with my clients when they're doing job searches, they get really crystal clear on what are the exact roles that they're going to be applying for are, and they cap those distinct roles to 2 to 3, right? So data analyst, policy advisor, and something else, right? Or data analyst and policy analyst or policy advisor. And then from there, we kind of let go of this idea that we need to keep close to our chest or our vest or fully release our disciplinary expertise, right? So I heard you say I have sort of a more crimmy focused one, and then I have sort of a more general one. I don't think anybody should have a general resume. I think people should have specific resume templates that match the roles that they are applying for. And so those roles could be trainer and facilitator, policy analyst, and a more data-centric job. And the idea would be throughout those 3 templates, you are going to, if and when relevant, integrate pieces of your experience from the crim and CJ field. But you're also going to be talking about yourself a little differently and emphasizing a little differently where are those skill sets and interest areas based on what are those titles, those distinct titles that you're applying for. And to be a little ruthless with yourself and say for 3 months, that's it. I'm not, the store isn't open for relitigating the roles themselves, because what that can do is create just a lot of confusion and a lot of like stepping on our own tails. So when I work with clients, it's always, do you actually know? Have you done that contemplative piece? It sounds like you're really self-aware and you have a pretty good sense of like what those roles might be. Can you really land on up to 3 and no more than 3 that generally can be the banner under which some various versions of that job might live, right? So something that is about data and applied research might be called a data analyst, might be called a data scientist, right? So like that would be one category of roles, and you would have a resume for that category of roles. And then for every single job that you apply for, you would use that template if it's in that job category, but you would then further tweak that template for the specific role that you're applying for. So I really tell folks it's a good idea to get away from the like disciplinary specific sort of more academic-y resume, and here's a general one for everything else. Usually having templates that are role specific, because the actual verbs that you're going to be asked to speak to likely will maybe have some overlap, but will certainly have some points of divergence. So on the materials side of things, that's one thing that I would recommend. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of organization, and it takes a lot of self-awareness and clarity, but it is a very, very good step. The other thing that I would recommend is, I don't know who looked over your CV. I think it's great to have somebody that you talk to that then sort of inputs, I did this as a research assistant, and then this is the output you get for a bullet for a resume. Just be really cautious that person actually understands what academia is and what some of the funky jargon things are that we use that are a little bit harder to translate for folks that don't have that experience. And see, before you send things out, can you find an acquaintance, a friend, a Shannon, me, somebody like that that has made the switch to kind of look at one of the templates and say, are you talking about like a student committee work here? Are you talking about an independent study here? Like, because we understand and know what the academic like work life looks like as well. And I have actually had a number of clients come to me that have paid people to do the conversion, but they're paying people that understand the industry side of things, but they don't understand the academic side of things, and that can be impactful. So those are our 2 quick tips just to get you scratching the surface.
Okay, thank you so much. That's super helpful. I really appreciate it.
You are so welcome, and good luck.
And with that, I know we have a couple minutes left. So I just want to say, you know, I saw that Sarah put her email address in the chat. Should you want to reach out with her, she's available. And Sarah, do you want to offer how folks can find you otherwise, or and maybe give like a real quick high level interview of overview of the kind of work that you do with clients and how you do that work?
Sure. So I work with clients primarily in three ways right now. I work with clients most oftenly through what I call the Activation Jumpstart package. So that's about a 4-month package of one-on-one sessions with me that are both coaching and strategy related. So the first month or so, I'm going to get to know you. I'm going to figure out your why. I'm going to learn about some of the shoulds that you absorbed that led you to the academy and then led you to sort of iterate in the version of the academy that you ended up on, and to talk about some of that grief if it's been emergent, or to your point, Shannon, just some of the other life stuff that is compelling you to thinking about other pathways. Then we'll work really hard at sort of clarifying this question of like, what is that bridge? How do we build that bridge between this academic identity and the great beyond, right? Like, what are those things, those facets of your experience professionally, educationally, that like really make you tick? And then how do we like actually celebrate the shit out of me search, do some self-ethnography, and like dedicate the time to be in your own research subject for a little bit? Then once we do that, we get either the roles down that we have, or we get the sort of idea for a business down. And then we spend the last month like hitting the pavement, right? So I do document review, I do materials review, I do interview prep, I do negotiation help, I do business plan reviews, I do help like concierge research help with people if they are looking for, hey, I want to become a web designer. So it runs the gamut of anything. That's my most popular package. So that's a 4-month way that I work with folks. I also do a longer, much more concierge level style work. That's for people that is a 6-month program, and for people that are like, I need an effing job like yesterday. I do a half-day workshop, one-on-one, in-person or virtual. People get to pick, and you get a bunch of sessions with me and all the same materials review. You get to, in either of those packages, be on a portal of mine in which you can direct message me. We have file sharing, etc. And then I offer one-time 90-minute strategy sessions. These are also becoming more popular, where people will send me in advance. So Megan, you would send me the 2 resumes you have. I would annotate them. I would look at them. I would edit them. I would ask you to send me some example jobs or roles that you're interested in. We would meet. We would have a really productive hour and a half. And then I would send you a customized playbook about what I recommend moving forward in your job search. And the last thing I'll say is, in celebration of women and International Women's Month, we need more than a month, but I am offering that strategy session for half off for the rest of the month. Just for anybody with whom and for whom the message that I'm trying to bring resonates and you want to support a woman-owned business.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Sarah. I really appreciate that. I feel like I'm like, damn, where were you 3 years ago? So
I was locked down, like rubbing marker from my laptop.
I know. And instead I was like, just like running circles around my house, being like, where am I going? What am I doing? I need a job. I ran out of funding. How do I, like, what do I need to do? I have no financial support. So I appreciate you. I hope that no one is ever in a position like me, who's like running around trying to find, how do I pay my bills? What am I going to do? And that they really are able to kind of rely on some of your services to help them find the thing that really gets their goat going. And I think that you offer a lot of that. And I appreciate you coming to the space radically brave, saying things that the quiet stuff out loud that we often don't say, and giving people the space to have permission to do whatever the hell it is they want to do. And also still recognizing that it's also sad to leave, or recognize it's sad to understand what you're living in as well, right? That you can want to be in it and be sad by it. You might want to leave it and be sad by it. And I don't think we necessarily give people the space to grieve the romanticized version of what we thought the academic journey would look like. And so I'm really thankful that you're here to also offer that, in addition to telling us, once you move through it, let's talk about your desires and your next first thing.
Totally. Yes. And I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I have a Facebook page for my business called the Square Peg Club. Please connect with me. Reach out to me. People will DM me and ask me questions. I'm always happy to help if I can. If I have, a little time, and even if it's a time sensitive thing, I'm happy to take a quick question, to provide you a link or a resource or some guidance. So please feel free to connect with me, be in touch, and find other people like Shannon too that are also out here doing the damn thing. So it was so good to be here, Shannon. Thank you so much for everything you're doing for students and professors too.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll talk to you all shortly. Have a good day.
Thanks so much. Bye.